Greetings, salam, shakumaku. How are you, dear listeners? Podcasting from the old railway depot in Swamp Poodle, Washington, D.C., welcome to Iraq Matters, an epic podcast of news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq and about people who have Iraq in their story. We believe that Iraq matters, and we're passionately interested in matters of Iraq. We also believe in the importance of raising awareness about the humanitarian crisis of our generation, the plight of millions of Iraqis who remain displaced alongside millions of Syrians fleeing internal violence. I'm David Slater, standing in for Eric Gustafson, who is currently in northern Iraq. Thank you for joining us as we grow a community of support for humanitarian action and peace. And here's the lay of the land for today's program.
Thanks, David. I'm Shanaz Weiss with Iraq Matters. In today's podcast, we will focus on Iraq's oil wealth and whether it helps or hurts the country's prospects for peace and development. Today's program includes Joel Wing's latest Iraq update, an interview with Professor Bilal Wahab of American University of Iraq, Sulaimani, about his hopes for the future and his current research on Iraq's oil sector, energy policy, and the impact on the country's overall development. An exchange between the distinguished Iraq historian Phebe Marr and Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari about Iraq's progress in passing a hydrocarbon law. The exchange occurred during a recent event hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. We also talk with Ahmed Ali about current popular trends among the youth of Iraq. But first, a campaign update. Here at EPIC, we're working to put Iraq back on the agenda. Our petition on change.org now has the support of nearly 4,500 signers. We need your help. Tell your friends and colleagues about our campaign at iraqmatters.org. To underscore the urgency, consider these facts. The UN reports that violence and terrorism in August killed 804 Iraqis and wounded another 2,030. Lower than July, but still one of the highest monthly tolls in more than 5 years. The report also says almost 5,000 civilians have been killed in Iraq and 12,000 injured since the beginning of the year. Meanwhile, at least 3 million Iraqis remain displaced, contributing to a growing regional humanitarian crisis that includes over 6 million displaced Syrians. As many as 200,000 of those Syrians have fled to Iraq, with over 50,000 Syrian refugees entering Iraq's Kurdistan Region within the last few weeks alone, the UN reports. While the world is divided about how to end the war in Syria, there should be no disagreement about the urgency to do more to help millions of innocent civilians, most of them children aged 17 years and under, who have been forced to flee their homes and support neighboring countries coping with influx. Yet to date, humanitarian agencies have received less than half the funds they need to respond to the crisis. Today is Thursday, September 12th. It has been 640 days since President Barack Obama last met with Iraq's Prime Minister or made any public statement about an ongoing U.S. commitment to the people of Iraq. Like Syria, the escalating violence in Iraq demands more attention at the highest levels, and President Obama's leadership can make a critical difference. Join us in urging the Obama administration and Congress to do more to support strong humanitarian action and diplomacy for a more peaceful Iraq. You can join our growing community of supporters at iraqmatters.org. EPIC is also participating in the Start a Riot Challenge on CrowdRise. Please donate to our fundraiser to expand our Photo Voice Iraq program to include Iraqi youth in Baghdad and Syrian youth in the Dome East refugee camp. To donate, visit crowdrise.com/enablingpeace. As this podcast goes into production, our executive director, Eric Gustafson, is in northern Iraq preparing for the launch of Photo Voice this October. With your help, we can extend Photo Voice's reach. Shukran and Sourcefast listeners. Now to you, Chelsea.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In today's Iraq update, we're here with Joel Wing. Hello, Joel.
Hi, how you doing?
So, Joel, what's been happening in Iraq over the past month?
The number one story is the continued violence in the country. The insurgency is making a comeback. It's basically been revived after many people thought it was basically ending. The latest casualty figures for August were all still very high. The only group that disagreed with that was the Iraqi government, which had far lower figures than other people like Iraq Body Count or the United Nations. And that's been consistently true since 2011 when Prime Minister Maliki gained control of the Defense and Interior Ministries he's basically politicized the reporting on the casualty figures each month. So they report lower and lower figures of how many deaths. At first, it seemed like when violence was going down, he wanted the figures to even be lower than other groups to show that he had secured the country and he'd brought peace and fought off the insurgency. And now that the insurgency is taking off, he's trying to make the figures low because he's being criticized and being attacked for not being able to provide safety and security to the population, since obviously he is the prime minister. So the violence is the biggest story in Iraq right now.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for your Iraq update.
Thank you.
And now our special guest interview with Professor Bilal Wahab.
Hello, my name is Leslie Harkins. I'm one of Epic's summer interns. I'm joined today by Iraq War vet David Slater and our special guest Bilal Wahab. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Could you give us a little brief introduction? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Bilal Wahab, currently teaching at the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani, which is a city in Iraqi Kurdistan. I went to American University here in Washington, D.C. for my master's, and then later on a Fulbright scholarship, I'm proud to say. Later on, joined George Mason University for a PhD. In Iraq, I worked for several USAID contractors on democracy promotion and rule of law. While here, I was a research assistant at Mason. I also had short-term jobs at the World Bank and some other due diligence companies.
Well, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
So let's just jump right in. With perhaps the world's second largest oil reserves, what is preventing Iraq from cashing in its natural endowments like other Gulf-rich nations?
It's actually Iraq's main challenge, because oil by nature has this tendency of being paradoxical. On the one hand, you see, all right, this country is blessed, quote unquote, with oil, and therefore it should be able to spend the money and build anything they want. But actually, if you look at the history of countries that have oil, the picture is drastically different. Many of the oil-dependent countries are actually poor. Statistically speaking, looking at the data, countries that have a lot of natural resources, their economies perform weaker than countries compared to countries that do not have natural resources. So unfortunately, a lot of countries actually miss the opportunity of the blessing, and oil turns into a curse. One reason that this happens is that oil has the tendency of becoming what's called a point source, which means it crowds out other sources of economic activity. So if you have oil, for example, the case of Iraq, it costs about between $1 to $4 to produce a barrel of oil, and you can sell it for, let's say, $90 in the market. Therefore, all of the investment money that you have in the economy is going to go for oil, at the expense of the other sectors, including agriculture, including industry. Now, agriculture and industry are the kind of economic sectors that employ a lot of people, but oil does not have that feature. You can only have maybe a couple of dozen people working at an oil rig that produces millions and millions of dollars. So it throws a lot of cash into an economy, but does not create jobs. Therefore, it's the job of the government, is the mandate of the government to invest the oil revenue in other sectors to diversify the economy and create jobs and promote development. Now, if you do not have a government that's actively doing this, then oil by default is not going to create economic development. So the opportunity is there for Iraq. The resource is abundant. Fortunately, the government so far, including the previous regime, has failed to translate oil wealth into economic prosperity.
So why is energy policy so important for the future of Iraq, and how do you see it as linked to democracy?
Oil is actually the heart of Iraqi economy, is the lifeblood. But it also has huge implications for the trajectory that Iraq is on and will be in decades from now. If you look at oil-dependent countries, the only country that is a functioning democracy is Norway. the rest of the countries, you cannot call them a functioning democracy. Well, Mexico is trying to catch up. But unfortunately, the majority of the countries, including the Gulf states that you mentioned, are not democracies. And the reason is that, this point source, this easy to control revenue can be managed by a small group. That group could be a political party, it could be a family, it could be the military. And this group can then use the oil revenues, the natural resource revenues, to either suppress their society by financing and funding multiple layers of security and intelligence, and therefore oppressing their society into submission, or co-opting their society into submission by buying the loyalties of tribes, of NGOs. In case of competitive political systems, I don't want to say democracies, but where you have elections, then political parties that have access to the oil revenue can simply buy the election, can simply buy the votes. And unfortunately, this is a trend that is happening in Iraq.
From the co-opting or the suppressing?
The co-opting is happening in Iraq because under Saddam Hussein it was more the suppressing. Saddam Hussein, as you know, had multiple layers of security and intelligence, and dissent was, there was zero tolerance toward dissent. You have, chemical attacks on the Kurds, the Anfal, of course, drawing the marshes. So in the case of Saddam Hussein, it was one party that became, one family that was suppressing the society into submission. In Iraq, such a power, such a figurehead is missing right now. So you have multiple sources of power, multiple centers of power that are vying for control, vying for a larger footprint in the country. And we have elections. Since 2003, we've had consistent elections. The challenge for Iraq's democracy is and will remain in the long run whether competition between political parties are over policies or over patronage networks. Because if during elections people are going to vote for the best policy, for the best party that has the better platform, then that's a step in the right direction. However, if elections are merely keeping the people who are in power because they pay my salary or because I vote for a certain political party depending on sectarianism, then this kind of elections, unfortunately, are not going to lead to democracy, but rather to strengthen and deepen the patronage network. And unfortunately, this is happening, all over Iraq because businesses are tied to ruling elites rather than being based on rule of law. And therefore, if, let's say, a business leader or, let's say, a tribal leader, maybe he does not like the current regime or the current ruler or the current party in power. However, their interest is tied to this particular person remaining in power. So this kind of setup and this kind of mechanism guts the whole purpose of holding elections. Now, the hope for this is to have centers of power for maybe the way out of this, if you were to ask that question, is to see economic development in other sectors other than oil, is to do diversification of the economy, is to see jobs created outside the government.
Is this something similar to what Dubai is doing?
Dubai is trying to diversify, but the Iraqi challenge is bigger than that because in Iraq we still don't have the infrastructure. So let me tell you what's happening, for example, in the Kurdistan region, which is the most stable, the most economically developed, also politically developed region in Iraq. Oil has created an unhealthy setup. Of course, it's developed. Is developing compared to the rest of the country. We have a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of development to functioning international airports. But despite this, 75% of the budget is handed down as salary, which means the government is the largest employer. If not, it has monopoly over employment. The business sector is very small. The private sector is very small in the economy when it comes to job creation. The KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, has about 1.5 million employees by government calculations. Well, this is a mechanism for the money to trickle down to people's hands, which is positive. And this is not happening in the rest of the country. That's why you have more poverty in the center and the south than you have in Kurdistan. But even in Kurdistan, this is not healthy because, one, what if the price of oil goes down? How can the government... Well, the price of oil does go down, right? It fluctuates even on a daily basis. In 2008, it went from $34 to $120. So with the fluctuation of oil prices, the government may not be able to fund all of these public employees on one hand. On the other, this is just simply not sustainable. And three, this is not the way to promote economic growth and economic development. Because this is just layers and layers of bureaucracy, and this is just ghost employment. This is not real employment. This is not the kind of employment that promotes growth. This is also not good for democracy, because you want economic development that offers people choices. You want people to be entrepreneurial. You want them to operate in a market that gives them choices. The whole idea of economic development leading to democracy is that you give people choices in the market. Then eventually they will ask for choices in politics. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I say this is because Iraq is at crossroads. On the one hand, there are trajectories that are going well for Iraq. There's economic development, poverty is going down, illiteracy is going down. The potential for economic and political progress, for democracy, is there. At the same time, unfortunately, there are things that are not going well for Iraq, like the re-emergence of sectarianism, of course, given the conflict in Syria. It's not helping. Rampant corruption. Iraq, by money value, is the most corrupt country in the world. By Iraq's own calculations, by the Integrity Commission, since 2003, around $130 billion are missing. Iraq's annual GDP is $100 billion. So you're talking about more than a year's budget entirely missing. On the other hand, you still lack stability and security. You've seen a resurgence of violence and bombings in Iraq, and generally Iraqis feel a lack of willingness, a lack of desire for growth, for good policies, for economic development. The way that many see politicians are, they see them as people whose main goal is to grab to power and therefore use any means possible at their disposal to cling to power. So Iraq could go very badly, but it also has the potential of actually going in the right direction. That's why I'm very sad to say that in my visit to Washington, D.C. in the past month, I see that Iraq is completely off the radar screen. But this is the perfect time to nudge Iraq in the right direction. This is the perfect time to encourage what is going well for Iraq and discourage what's going not so well for Iraq. But unfortunately, the international influence, the positive international influence, and especially coming from Washington, D.C. at this moment, is absent.
And that's exactly what we're trying to advocate with our Put Iraq Back on the Agenda petition that's in circulation. So you brought up the huge corruption problems in Iraq. How effective has the Maliki administration been in pursuing these problems in corruption and addressing the oil smuggling issues?
Corruption and oil smuggling. Corruption is, as I said, is a major challenge. It's a major challenge for economic development, for service provision. It's also a challenge for building good governance and building a reliable government that Iraqis can relate to, Iraqis can put their trust into. Now, Iraq has some institutions that were established to fight corruption, like the Commission on Public Integrity. The Iraqi Parliament, for example, has an active anti-corruption committee. On the oil side, Iraq is signatory to Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which mandates both governments and oil companies to declare their sales and their transactions publicly, so people, to promote transparency and people can have access to these data. So you have these institutions in place, but unfortunately, the size of corruption is too big for these institutions. Just having institutions that do not have power, don't have enough power in the case of Iraq, is not enough. I think what is missing is a serious political will to curb corruption. And unfortunately, this goes back to my previous point, because the goal of today's politicians is not good governance, but is maintaining power, grabbing more power. And unfortunately, sometimes corruption simply helps to achieve the goal of achieving more. Some issues, like for example the Russian arm deal that Iraq wanted to purchase some weapons from Russia, that became high profile. The media gave it due attention. Opposition political parties put the spotlight on it. So issues like that, then get to the fore and they get debated. which tells me that if the civil society is active enough, if the media is active enough, and to give them credit, they are active, and if they try to make a story embarrassing enough, then action will be taken. But there is also a negative thing that's happening in Iraq, is sometimes corruption is actually used as a weapon against political opponents, which is a sad phenomenon that's been happening in the past several years.
And just to go back a couple minutes ago, you mentioned the Kurdistan Regional Government, KRG. In recent weeks, there has been talks of KRG President Masoud Barzani and Iraqi Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki having quote-unquote positive vibes over the new oil and gas law. Can you describe what this law would change and its significance for the region?
So to give you a bit of background, one of the major changes in the Iraqi oil industry after 2003 has been the return of international oil companies. Well, in the late 70s, the Iraqi government, under the Ba'ath regime, nationalized Iraq's hydrocarbon industry. And therefore international oil companies have been out of the country in any significant way ever since. So after 2003, the Iraqi government did not have enough resources, enough revenue, enough technological capability to revamp the oil and gas industry. Therefore, it was even enshrined in the constitution that market tools, including contracting, international contracting, will be used to rebuild the Iraqi oil infrastructure. So Iraqi oil companies are back. The constitution is written in a way that grants powers to regions, to provinces that produce oil, but these rights and responsibilities, although enshrined in the constitution, they were not translated into actionable laws. So Iraq still lacks a national hydrocarbons law that regulates the oil industry. Therefore, the Kurdistan Regional Government adopted a regional law according to the Kurdish interpretation of the constitutional clauses, and therefore has given the Kurdish government, the right to contract out its blocks and oil blocks in the Kurdish region to international oil companies. Now, Baghdad does not like this, and that's the source of the conflict. Baghdad calls the contracts between Kurdistan government and oil companies as illegal. Another part of this, in addition to the contract, is revenue sharing, because Baghdad generates revenue and the Kurdistan government generates revenue, and there's been dispute about how to share these revenues. So these two issues, revenue sharing and the right to contract oil blocks, are at the heart of the dispute between the regional government and the Kurdish government. And to be honest with you, there are more incentives to both sides to come to a deal. It is better for Iraq as a whole. It's better for the producing regions. It's also better for the oil companies that operate there to have more confidence, for the country and the Kurdistan region to be able to attract better companies, more established companies. But the conflict has been more political and ideological than pragmatic. So once these our leaders put their right mind together, I think the solution should be with arm's length.
We now take a break from our conversation with Professor Bilal Wahab. The following is an exchange between Iraq historian Phebe Marr and Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari at a recent event hosted by CSIS.
Mr. Minister, I'd like to, Phebe Marr, an independent scholar on Iraq for a long time. I'd like to add my word of welcome and please come visit us more often. I do have a question. I'd like to get back to oil. One of the things, as you know, that's inhibiting investment is the lack of a hydrocarbon law. How close is Iraq really to achieving a hydrocarbon law? And please give us some sense of all these pipeline proposals we hear about to take place. The independent one from Kurdistan to Turkey, the new one from Baghdad through Turkey, potential through Jordan. What are we to make of those, and how realistic are any of them?
Thank you, Phebe. It's good to see you here, and still same spirit. And the hydrocarbon law is one of the key political challenges for Iraq or for the new Iraq. On the basis of the Iraqi constitution that devolved power and wealth, let's say, among the region, among the people. And only recently the Iraqi parliament passed a legislation to enhance the powers of the governorates, of the local authorities, let's say, in each governorate in Iraq. And it has been a political issues between the KRG and Baghdad, really, this hydrocarbon law. We had a version we agreed in 2007 that was accepted by both sides, but it didn't materialize. Still, it is the key reference point. Because of the deteriorations of relations between the KRG and Baghdad, there has been a separation of thinking, of planning, of using the oil resources and approaches with Turkey and Iran also. For your information, it's not just Turkey. But really, I'm not pessimistic and hopeless that for finding a resolution of this, because it benefits the country, it benefits everybody, it enhances Iraqi oil industry, the issue of ownership, the issue of reliability, let's say, for other oil investors to work in Iraq. It is very, very important subject, and it is a top issues in all the political meetings between the but whether it could be enacted soon, I don't want to give you any false impression. I believe this issue is one of the existential issues in the new Iraq. It has to be resolved with partnership, with participation, with genuine resolutions of the key political issues that are hindering Iraq. I personally believe there is a better atmosphere now. There's better communication. Recently, after the exchange of visits by Prime Minister Maliki to Erbil and President Barzani to Baghdad, they have agreed to address this issue frankly and to form a serious technical commissions to look at the issues. There is also related to the hydrocarbon law, the revenue sharing in the country as a whole. They are related. These two issues, I think they are doable, but depends a great deal on the political understanding between the leaders. Yes, the KRG is trying to enhance its position through opening up to Turkey. Turkey's relations with Baghdad are not at the best stage, which is something we are trying, that normalizing relations between Ankara and Baghdad could benefit all, including the KRG. And these pipelines, they are also controversial issues, to be honest with you. I mean, there is no agreement on them. And we agreed that soon, very soon, in Baghdad, there would be a meeting of these commissions to address the issue of the pipelines and to see whether we can finalize the hydrocarbon law before the end of this year or be left until next year elections, which most likely it would be.
Now back to our conversation with Professor Bilal Wahab.
Which countries and international companies are benefiting the most from these oil contracts?
Iraq, I hope, first and foremost. But I guess that's not your question. Your question is about which countries behind oil companies, I guess.
Right.
There is no one or two countries that have oil companies operating in Iraq. Actually, for example, in the case of the Kurdistan Regional Government, more than 50 contracts have been signed, and I believe more than 20 countries are represented. I can go back to my notes and correct that piece of data for you. But it's not just one single country or maybe just a couple countries. In fact, the usual culprits, United States and United Kingdom, were actually very latecomers. The first company that came to Kurdistan was a Norwegian company, followed by a Turkish company. In Iraq, you do have Exxon and Shell and Chevron operating. You also have Chinese companies, Russian companies, also in the Kurdistan region. So as far as countries behind oil companies are concerned, it's diversified. And I think it's also something good on the Iraqi side to sign contracts with as many companies as possible in order to, well, first not give that image of certain countries being beneficiaries of Iraq's oil, but also not to have the Iraqi oil industry tied to one country's national interest, but rather be tied to several countries. But of course, in the case of Iraq, the major and the super major oil companies operate in the south. In the Kurdistan regional government, the majority of the companies are what the industry calls them wildcatters. Small oil companies that are not as risk averse as big oil companies. So they come in, they look for oil. So majority of the oil companies in the north are like this. But of course, where the Kurdish oil industry is going to the phase of consolidation, which means major oil companies are now entering the scene, entering the Iraqi Kurdish oil sector, and they're buying the blocks from the smaller wildcatters. For example, Exxon is deliberating such deals, and Total is also up in the north now.
In a recent New York Times article, which was published on June 2nd of 2013, the New York Times says basically that China is the chief beneficiary right now of the oil contracts. Would you agree with that?
I do, because several reasons. One, the Chinese have entered into joint ventures with other oil companies as well, other than just acting solely. Two, a company like Exxon, for example, is a commercial company that does not, let's say, get orders from the State Department. Chinese oil companies are not just there for the commercial interest. They're not only after the commercial interest, but they're also there for geopolitical goals and national security, Chinese national security purposes, which makes them a good partner for Iraq because their arms are easier to twist. They're easier to give them a bad deal. Basically, a Chinese oil company may be willing to sign a bad contract because they want to have a footstep in Iraq, a foot in the door, while, let's say, a commercial company may not want that, may not sign a contract in Iraq and go somewhere in Africa if they think that, that contract is not commercially viable. So this gives the Chinese companies an edge over the traditional oil companies. So there is truth to that, but this doesn't mean that they have monopoly. No single oil company has monopoly over Iraq's oil industry, neither with the federal government in Baghdad, nor with the regional government in Kurdistan.
Previously, you mentioned that there's a connection between Syria and Iraq, specifically in smuggling. Is the oil smuggling that's happening in Iraq, is that affecting Syria and vice versa?
First of all, oil smuggling has a history in the country. You know that in 1991, after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, in 1991, comprehensive sanctions were imposed on Iraq, including on oil and gas exports. And of course, one way for the Saddam Hussein regime to go around the sanctions was to establish an intricate web of oil smuggling that, also used neighboring countries, whose governments colluded with the Iraqi regime because, it's a win-win situation to charge a transit fee. Now, many of these networks were intact when Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled in 2003, which means someone else can come and use the same network. So right after 2003, one of the major problems that Iraq faced, both with revenue generation, revenue collection, but also with providing fuel for the Iraqi citizenry, was oil smuggling. Now, of course, at the time, a lot of focus was on sectarian insurgency, but the question that many people were not asking enough was, how do people get their money from? How do the insurgent groups, the militias, get their money from? And one major source of revenue was actually oil smuggling, because Iraq was subsidizing fuel at the local market. It did not have refining capacity, so Iraq had to give crude to the neighboring countries and then buy back the refined product at a discounted rate. So this created an automatic incentive for people to basically smuggle the fuel across the border again, and this was a huge source of revenue for sectarian militias as well as insurgent groups, including Al-Qaeda. There were reports also that when Baghdad was not allowing the Kurdish government to export oil through the pipelines, that the Kurdish region was a source for oil smuggling. So what I want to say here is that oil smuggling is this factor that seems to be shared and common all over Iraq. Oil is being smuggled from the south using ships and small vessels. The border with Jordan, the border with Syria, and the border with Iran and Turkey. These are porous borders that are rife with oil smuggling. Now, we know that in Syria, majority of the refining facilities are under the control of the rebels, and nonetheless, the Syrian regime is able to, fuel the tanks and fuel the jet fighters. I have not seen evidence, but I have read reports and I have talked to people who, with better information, with better intel, that talk about how, groups in Iraq might be providing the Syrian army with the necessary fuel that they need to wage the war against the rebels. I won't be surprised to also say that there are other groups that probably provide the rebels in Syria with fuel and opportunities, like funds that are generated from oil smuggling. Oil smuggling is a major issue in Iraq. Unfortunately, it does not get due attention.
You mentioned that oil has to be exported from Iraq in order to get refined, and then they re-import it. Is there any talk about creating refineries within Iraq?
Yes, that's been one of the major progresses that have been happening in Iraq, is building refineries and develop Iraq's refining capacity. Now, Iraq still imports some of its refined products like gasoline and kerosene, but that is one major area for investment in Iraq.
So for our final questions, why does Iraq matter, and what makes you hopeful about Iraq's future?
What makes me hopeful is that since 2003, no single person and no single party or single sect has been able to dominate the entire country. Iraq may lack democrats in the sense of people who eat and breathe and drink democracy, but at least there is competition. There is competition between political parties, and there is competition to the top between regions and provinces. And if there is hope for Iraq, if there is hope for Iraq's democracy, is to keep these competitions alive. The main challenge that Iraq is faced with, which in a nutshell is going back to dictatorship. Unfortunately, we have the recipe to go back to dictatorship. It will be a different kind of dictatorship. It won't be, the Saddam Hussein type dictatorship. It won't be suppression dictatorship. It will probably be co-optation kind of dictatorship. Call it a benign dictatorship, which unfortunately some in DC may be happy with. To have lower levels of violence and to have a person or a party who at least holds the country together, even if he suppresses the media, even if he sidelines opponents, even if he attacks using judicial or extrajudicial means to attack opponents. I don't think that's the right policy. If Iraq is going to have hope, is to keep this rivalry, for example, between Kurdistan government and the federal government alive. Because the federal government, for example, comes and says, our oil contracts are more nationalistic, are superior to KRG oil contracts because it gives the country the most return for every barrel of oil that's produced. The KRG government shoots back and says, our policy is actually better because we have attracted better companies and we have provided better results and faster. This is the kind of debate you want to have. This is the kind of competition that you want to have. The KRG government says, my policy is better because I have provided my citizens with more hours of electricity, of power, than the federal government has been able to. The Iraqi parliament shoots back and says that the federal parliament is more diverse and more active in terms of legislation holding the government to account than the KRG parliament. These rivalries, this competition to the top are good, are positive, and they should be promoted, they should be encouraged. Unfortunately, what is wrong to do in Iraq is to basically hope for stability at the expense of democracy. And if that's the policy, unfortunately, it's a failed policy because it has been tried over and over again, and it has failed.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Bilal Wahab, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now for today's Culture Corner with Ahmed Ali.
What do you believe to be one of the biggest pastimes in Iraq?
Sure, I would say it's Facebook at the moment.
Probably here as well.
Yeah, we're actually seeing it with our Facebook page on Iraq. We get a lot of Iraqis, and even with the petition, a lot of Iraqis are signing the petition. So,
Facebook has become an important means for Iraqi youth to interact with the outside world. Iraqis and Iraqi youth in particular are increasingly using Facebook for to communicate with the outside world or to see what is taking place outside of the country. But of course, Iraq's pastime is soccer, and it's a major sport. I've had pleasure of playing soccer myself, starting in Iraq for a very long time, and continues to be the most popular and played sport in the country.
Ahmed, I remember in 2007 when the Iraqi team beat the Saudi team in the Asia Cup. Do you think that this success will happen again?
It is possible, but not easy, because that team that won in 2007 had players who were at the peak of their career and had been playing together since 2000. Actually, the core of that team, and many of them were skillful players. But after that, the same group is not at the same level. For the senior team, it is in a rebuilding phase, but of course the 2007 success was a critical moment for Iraq, because that was a very violent period of time for the country, and Iraqis were looking for good news and a symbol of unity, and they found that national team to be the vehicle and the institution that they could look to and say, this represents the country. But for now, the national team is in a rebuilding phase.
it's still such a great story. I mean, I remember in 2007, even with all the violence, people took to the streets and celebrating for, days almost. Yeah.
I know recently the under-20 team placed fourth in the under-20 Cup. It seemed to me there were very similar sentiments when they won the quarterfinals and went to the semifinals to play against Uruguay. When they beat South Korea in the quarterfinals, I saw pictures of Iraqis going to the street and celebrating. And to me, it reminded me very similarly of 2007. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, the under-20 team, which is the youth team of Iraq, they just concluded playing in the World Cup for the national youth teams. And what the team did was inspirational in many ways, despite the fact that it did not win the championship or did not make it to the final game, but it made it to the semi-final, as you said, which is the equivalent of the Final Four for those who follow basketball, or essentially a conference final for those who follow football and baseball. So it was an important achievement. It did have a positive impact. You saw politicians from different political parties congratulate the team and in some cases take credit for the success of the team. But overall it was a good moment, and I mentioned in my last comment that the national team is in a rebuilding phase. I think the players from the under-20 team will be the core of that rebuilding phase, because they are good players and they played with a lot of courage.
This has been Iraq Matters, an epic podcast of news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq. Thank you so much for joining us. We would like to make a special thank you to Hassan in Michigan, Reginald and Jamie in the Washington area, and Akil, Mashan, and Ibrahim in Iraq for volunteering to spread the word about our petition to put Iraq back on the agenda. If you would like to get involved, please email us at iraqmatters@yahoo.com. We would also like to thank our special guest, Bilal Wahab, from the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani. Our theme music is Fauga Nakhal by Nazim al-Ghazali, and our transitional music is from Raheem Al-Hajj's title track, The Second Baghdad. You can subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can also donate to our Start a Riot campaign at crowdrise.com/enabling peace. This is David Slater reminding you and friends around the world that Iraq matters.